My milk has dried up, human. My baby hasn't eaten for days. An alien mother begged for her child. The dust always settled slow on Xylem, like grief taking its time, and Dr. Julian Marr had grown used to watching both. He crouched near the edge of the perimeter fence, his gloved fingers brushing over soil that once pulsed with life. 4 months ago, satellite photos had shown faint traces of vegetation still clinging to the higher ridgelines, bioluminescent, wind-fed, haunting. Now it was all the same, dull gray. His sampler clicked once, recording atmospheric drift, and he logged the numbers without looking. The planet was dying, not explosively, quietly. With every passing day, it simply lessened. The outpost behind him blinked quietly against the gloom, powered by solar collectors that drank what little light Xylem's twin suns still gave. No permanent human presence had ever taken root here, only research detachments, rotating scientists tasked with monitoring collapse. They were forbidden to interfere, observe, record, report. Julian had followed that rule for 4 long months. Then the sensors chimed once, soft but unmistakable. Motion, just beyond the fence. He looked up. At first he thought it was heat distortion. Xylem's atmosphere could play tricks, bending light like water. But this shape didn't waver. It moved, steady, upright. Something was approaching the compound on foot. He stood slowly, lowering the sampler. His breath caught. A woman, tall, thin, wrapped in torn ceremonial cloth, once white, now dimmed by dust and time. Her skin was a striking violet gray, smooth like polished stone. Long, ink-black hair fell loose over her shoulders. Cradled in her arms was something bundled in red cloth, limp against her chest. She passed the outer line of the sensors. They chirped, then stilled. No weapons, no threat, just silence. He stepped outside, the outpost door hissing closed behind him. She didn't stop walking. Her bare feet moved carefully over the cracked ground, like each step was a promise not to fall apart. When she finally stood before him, she didn't speak right away. Just looked at him with those enormous, glassy eyes, violet with flecks of gold, as if stars had drowned in them. Then in a voice hoarse and weathered, as though scraped across stone, "My milk has dried up, human. My baby hasn't eaten for days." Julian's pulse stuttered. Not the words, not exactly, but the way she said them. No drama, no pleading, just fact. He looked at the bundle in her arms. A child, tiny violet-skinned like her, limbs limp, mouth dry and cracked. Its chest rose barely. Too slow, too shallow. He hadn't held a child since Earth, since Olivia, since the hospital hallway where he'd stood frozen, helpless, while machines screamed and a nurse told him he was 5 minutes too late. And now this. "Come inside," he said, stepping back. She followed, slowly, carefully. He noted the way she walked, protecting the child from even the softest breeze. She was starving. Anyone could see that. But she moved like glass on the edge of shattering. Inside, the outpost lights adjusted. Climate seals closed behind them with a hiss. She blinked against the shift in light and warmth. Her gaze swept the room. Metal benches, analysis screens, racks of tagged soil samples. No comforts, just functionality. Julian opened a crate and pulled out a thermal blanket, then a sealed water pouch. He offered them both without speaking. She took the water but didn't drink. Instead, she tilted the infant's head gently and squeezed out a few drops. The child's throat fluttered once, then stilled. "How long?" he asked quietly. She didn't look at him, just murmured something low in her own tongue, a sound like wind over broken glass. Then in words shaped carefully, 4 rotations. He nursed nothing. "I walked. I followed the metal lines until I saw your light." He swallowed. The nearest village was hundreds of kilometers from here, and most had collapsed into dust long before his arrival. She must have walked without stopping, without eating, in this cold. "What's his name?" he asked. "Carrie," she said, pressing her lips to the child's temple. Julian dropped to one knee and unzipped the medical case. He couldn't save a child on Earth, but here, maybe here he could do something. He took a scanner and swept it over Carrie's body. Low thermal signature, dehydrated, no infection but dangerously malnourished. "We can try something," he murmured. "It won't be much, but—" She didn't interrupt. She just stared at him. And for the first time, he saw the tremble in her arms, not from fear, but from sheer exhaustion. He moved to prepare a low-pressure feeding line, nothing invasive, just enough to let the child receive fluid without choking. Her eyes followed every motion. "You're not afraid," he said without meaning to. "I have no room left for fear," she replied. Her voice was softer now, her face unreadable. "What's your name?" he asked. "Omria." He nodded, though her name hung in the air like a question he hadn't earned the right to ask. He retrieved a ration bar, broke off fragments, and mixed them into water. It wasn't milk, but it held nutrients. Basic proteins, simple sugars. Enough to buy time if the child's body didn't reject it. "May I?" he asked, motioning toward Carrie. She hesitated. Then she handed him over. Julian hadn't touched a child in years. His hands shook a little as he adjusted the tubing, measured the intake, dribbled the first drop past Carrie's lips. The child didn't stir. He waited. Second drop. Third. A faint twitch at the throat. A swallow. Omria gasped, not loud, but sharp, like breath she hadn't allowed herself to take until now. Carrie's chest lifted, fell, lifted again. Julian looked up and froze. Omria was crying, not the kind of tears that moved. These slid silently, slowly, down violet cheeks, disappearing into the dust on her skin. She didn't wipe them. She just sat, unmoving, eyes fixed on her child. "I thought he would die in my arms," she whispered, "and I had made peace with that, but now—" She didn't finish. Julian knelt beside her and placed the child back in her arms. She clutched him, wrapping him in the blanket, cradling his face like it was made of light. They didn't speak for a long time. Eventually, she leaned sideways, her head brushing against the wall. Her eyes closed. Not sleep, just release. Julian sat cross-legged across from them. The weight in his chest shifted, then settled. He knew the consequences. He had broken protocol. This could cost him everything. But that didn't matter now. A woman had walked across a dying planet to save her child, and a man who had once promised never to fail again had opened his door. Outside, the dust drifted, slow, silent, heavy, but inside, something resisted the pull of gravity. Something lived. The night deepened, not in darkness. Xylem never truly darkened, but in weight, in stillness, in the density of air that pressed down like stone. The wind had long since fallen silent. Dust lingered in the atmosphere like breath never released. Dr. Julian Marr sat at the edge of the low cot, motionless. Across the small room, Omria slept, if it could be called that. Her limbs were curled around the infant, a protective arc of bone and skin. One arm draped across Carrie's body, the other beneath her head. Her face was turned toward the child's. Their foreheads touched. Neither stirred. Julian watched the rise and fall of Kari's narrow chest, counting seconds between each breath. Shallow, irregular, but breathing, still breathing. He hadn't moved for over an hour. His back ached. His legs were numb from sitting so long without shifting. But he was afraid that if he did, if he so much as inhaled too deeply, the moment would fracture. A child's fragile existence was balanced on the knife edge between recovery and loss. And he'd lived on that edge before, once, long ago. He closed his eyes only for a heartbeat. Not here, not now. He stood carefully, easing each footstep as if the floor might betray him. The lab bench was cold to the touch, harsh steel against the damp warmth of his palm. He opened a diagnostics tray, slid out the nutrient cartridges, and laid out what he had left: powdered protein, stabilizers, glucose capsules, filtration strips. Supplies meant to keep a fully grown man alive for 10 days, now to be repurposed for something infinitely more delicate. The ration paste alone would be lethal to a child Carrie's size. Too dense, too fast digesting. He needed to synthesize something simpler, something that wouldn't overwhelm what little function the infant's digestive system still had. He set to work. The old reflexes returned as if summoned by muscle memory. Not elegant, improvised. He was a biologist, not a pediatrician. But science, real science, was not sterile and perfect. It was what you did when things fell apart, when people bled in your arms and there was no one left to call. He crushed a nutrient bar between layers of medical gauze, filtering it through microfiltration mesh. The resulting powder was fine as ash. He diluted it in distilled water, added trace elements, electrolytes, sugars, then ran it through the centrifugal processor to remove particulates. What emerged was a transparent, faintly gold solution, light refracting off it like broken glass. It wasn't milk, not even close, but it might work. He poured the liquid into a sterile dropper. It was warm from the device's thermal setting, barely above body temperature, enough to not shock the child's system. Behind him, Omria shifted. Her breath caught, sharp and quiet. Julian turned. She was awake, though her eyes hadn't opened. Her body remained curved around the child, but there was tension now, barely visible but unmistakable. Not fear. Readiness. Like a wild animal stirring under frost. He waited. Slowly, her eyes opened, luminous, quiet, sharp as cut crystal. She looked at him, not at the dropper. "I didn't mean to sleep," she said softly. Julian didn't answer. He crossed the room and knelt beside her, careful not to make a sound. He held up the dropper. "It's ready." She shifted upright, movement slow and protective. The child remained cradled in her lap. She said nothing, only offered the faintest nod of permission. Julian leaned forward and touched Carrie's lips with the dropper. The first drop rolled across the infant's tongue. Nothing. Second drop, a twitch, barely perceptible. Third, Carrie's throat convulsed. A weak swallow. Julian froze, waited, another swallow. A breath, deeper this time. He looked at the monitor. A small spike, heart rate up by 2 points. Oxygen saturation rising by decimal margins. Subtle, but real. "She's responding," he murmured. Omria said nothing, but her hand moved to rest against Carrie's cheek. Her fingertips trembled. The expression on her face didn't change, but her posture softened. Shoulders lowering, breath slowing, as if her bones had been carrying a centuries-old weight. And now, for the first time, the load shifted. Julian handed her the dropper. "She'll need more, slowly, a little every hour." Omria took it in silence. Her hand, when it brushed his, was warm. Warmer than before. Still cold, but no longer deathly. She cradled the dropper and bent over her child like a priestess before a dying altar. Julian stood and backed away, letting them have the space. He returned to the lab bench, but didn't sit. He leaned on the edge, watching her, unsure what to do with the silence between them. It wasn't hostile, just dense, like a language he hadn't learned yet. The room remained quiet for a long while. The only sounds were the soft hisses of the climate vents and Carrie's faint, rhythmic breaths. Then Omria spoke, not looking at him. "She will live," he hesitated. "I don't know," he said, "but she has a chance now." Another silence. "She wasn't meant to die like this," Omria said. "None of them were." Julian turned. "Others?" Her gaze flicked up. Not confirmation, not denial, but something passed through her expression. Grief, perhaps, or warning. "I followed the fences, the lights. There was nothing else." He nodded slowly. The implication hung in the air. She had walked alone through a dead world, looking for a stranger, because there was no one left to turn to. "What happened to your people?" he asked. She blinked slowly, the kind of blink that said, "Not now." So he didn't press. Instead, he moved to the storage unit, retrieved a sealed water pouch and handed it to her. "You should drink." Omria looked at it as if uncertain what to do. Then finally she uncapped it and sipped. Not greedily, carefully, slowly. Like someone who remembered how easy it was to lose everything given too quickly. Julian sat again. Not at the bench this time, but on the floor, near the heater. Legs drawn up, arms on his knees. He didn't look at her. He looked at the flame in the heater core, at the data screens, at the child breathing shallowly but rhythmically. "Why did you come here?" he asked finally. Omria didn't hesitate. "Because I had no one else." There was no bitterness in it, just truth. Julian closed his eyes. That was the worst part, the honesty. "I was stationed on Vega 4 once," he said. "Years ago, during the famine. I watched an entire outpost starve while the government debated intervention." Omria looked at him. "I lost a child," he said. She didn't respond. He didn't need her to. The fire crackled softly in the heating unit. The wind picked up outside, brushing against the walls like fingertips dragging across metal. Then faintly, Carrie stirred. A small sound, almost a whimper, escaped her lips. Omria bent over instantly, brushing her thumb against her daughter's cheek. Julian stood again. He gathered the remaining formula and returned to the lab to begin a second synthesis. Behind him, Omria's voice came low, almost inaudible. "You shouldn't have helped me." He turned. "Why?" She didn't answer for a long moment. Then, "Because you won't be allowed to stop." Julian didn't know what that meant. Not yet. But the way she said it, like prophecy, not warning, settled into him like a seed. He looked at her again. The curve of her body, shielding her child. The strength she'd carried across a broken world. She wasn't just here to save her daughter. She was here to see who would still care. He turned back to the machine and kept working, because caring, once chosen, demanded everything, and he already knew he wouldn't walk away. Not from them, not again. The next morning came without sunlight, as most mornings on Xylem did. The sky remained the same dim ash blue it had worn for centuries, unchanging even as the world beneath it crumbled. Inside the outpost, warmth lingered from the night heater. The recycled air hummed quietly through the filtration ducts. Carrie breathed gently in her mother's arms, his chest rising in a steadier rhythm than the night before. Julian watched from across the room, sitting on a supply crate with a steaming mug in his hands. He hadn't spoken yet. He didn't need to. There was something sacred about that quiet moment, the fragile hush that followed survival. Omria was still curled around the child. Her long black hair fell in tangled strands over her face, catching the soft glow of the overhead light. She hadn't noticed him watching. Or maybe she had and simply didn't care. Julian took a slow sip from the mug, the bitter taste grounding him. Protein brew. Barely palatable, but hot. Carrie stirred. A soft, breathy sound escaped his lips, almost a sigh. Omria looked down immediately, adjusting the cloth around him, pressing her fingers to his brow. Julian caught a small shift in her expression. Barely there, but unmistakable. Relief. It wasn't over. Not by any means. But something had shifted. He stood, set the mug aside, and walked to the bench where his makeshift formula still sat in the stabilizer. He checked the temperature, the viscosity. The mixture was holding. Just enough protein to support cellular repair. Just enough sugar to feed the brain. Just enough salt to keep the body from falling apart. Still stable, he said aloud. Omria looked up at him, her face unreadable. You're very quiet this morning, Julian said. I used all my words yesterday, she replied softly. He almost smiled at that. He brought over a small dropper of the solution and handed it to her. Their fingers brushed. Neither flinched this time. She cradled Carrie closer, tilted the child's head, and carefully released 2 drops into his mouth. Carrie swallowed. Then again. Julian watched the rhythm of it, measured, controlled. Omria moved like someone who had done this 1,000 times and was afraid this time might be the last. You're good at this, he said. Omria's eyes flicked toward him. At what? Being a mother. She didn't answer, but her fingers didn't stop moving. Julian sat back down on the crate. His shoulders ached from the tension of the past 24 hours. His mind was still spinning with data, vital signs, cellular uptake, hydration rates. But he pushed it aside. Numbers couldn't describe the feeling in the room. You said others were lost, he said. Omria's hand stilled. Yes, she answered. Before the cold came fully, before the rain stopped. She adjusted the cloth around Carrie again, smoothing it over his small legs. We were too many. Then we were too few. Those who had water kept it. Those who didn't faded. The elders died first. Then the healers. Then the singers. Julian leaned forward. And your mate? She didn't look at him. He was ash before Carrie opened his eyes. Silence returned like fog. Julian didn't press further. Grief had its own rhythm, and Omria's voice had begun to fray at the edges. I'm sorry, he said quietly. You're not the first to say that, she replied. But you're the first who stayed after saying it. Carrie made another sound, a quiet, fluttery whimper. Julian reached instinctively, but Omria raised a hand, not to stop him, but to reassure. He does that when he's not warm enough, she said, wrapping the blanket tighter. It's not fear, just discomfort. Julian nodded. I know the feeling. He glanced at the monitor again. Carrie's vitals were holding. It wasn't a miracle. It was science and timing. But it still felt like grace. He stood and moved to the corner of the room where a small environmental panel buzzed faintly. He adjusted the temperature slightly, increasing ambient warmth by 2 degrees. It wasn't much, but it might help. Omria watched him as he worked. Her eyes were thoughtful now, less guarded. You speak gently, she said. Julian turned. Is that unusual? For humans, she said. For soldiers, for watchers. I'm not a soldier, he said. No, she agreed, but you were something else. Once he didn't answer immediately. I used to believe I was here to help worlds like this one, he said. To document their decline, to preserve something before it was gone. And now? Now I think I was sent to watch them die. Omria nodded slowly. And you're tired of watching. It wasn't a question. Julian looked at her. Yes. For a while, the room settled into silence again, but this time it was different. Not emptiness, not tension, just space held between two people. Omria shifted Carrie in her arms and began to hum. A low, breathy sound, barely audible but resonant. It vibrated in the walls, soft as breath, ancient as stone. Julian stilled. He'd heard the melody before. Not the tune, but the type. It wasn't music, not exactly. It was something older, a thread of memory woven through sound. "What is that?" he asked. "A morning song," she said, "but also a lullaby." He sat back down, this time on the floor, closer. "Teach it to me," he said. Omria paused. She looked down at Carrie. Then, without another word, sang it again, this time just slightly louder. She repeated each phrase slowly, like shaping glass with her voice. Julian listened, then tried to echo her. His pronunciation was clumsy, his rhythm wrong, but he kept going, and Omria didn't laugh. She didn't correct him. She just sang it again and again, until his voice began to find the shape of it. When she finally stopped, her eyes had softened. There was something different in her posture now. Not trust, not yet, but no longer pure distance. "Why would you want to learn our songs?" she asked. "Because I don't want to forget what this feels like," he said. "What it means to be part of something. Not mine." Omria looked at him for a long moment. Then, without breaking eye contact, she shifted slightly and leaned Carrie toward him. Julian hesitated. Then he opened his arms. She laid the child in them slowly, with the care of a priestess placing flame in another's hands. Carrie made a small sound and curled instinctively into Julian's chest, the warmth drawing him deeper into sleep. Julian's arms closed gently around the child. He looked down at him, then up at Omria. He didn't speak. He didn't have to. Outside, the sky remained dim and lifeless. But inside the outpost, there was breath, heat, sound. And for the first time since Julian had set foot on this dying world, something that felt like belonging. Carrie slept in Julian's arms longer than he expected, long enough for the warmth of the child's fragile body to leach into his own skin. The child was still underweight, his limbs too thin, his skin dull, but he breathed now with less effort, less silence. Across the room, Omria sat in the same place she'd been for hours, back to the wall, one knee drawn to her chest, the other leg stretched out toward the soft hum of the portable heater. She hadn't moved except to watch Carrie sleep, watch Julian breathe. Neither of them spoke. The silence between them had shifted. It was no longer a wall. It was a room with open windows. Julian adjusted his hold on the child, gently shifting Carrie's head to a more comfortable angle against his chest. His own back ached from staying still for so long, but he didn't care. He wasn't ready to let go. Not yet. He finally broke the quiet. "Can I ask you something?" Omria didn't look up, but her eyes flicked toward him. "You may ask. Whether I answer is mine to choose." "Fair." He nodded slightly. "You said something that first day, about your milk. I didn't want to ask then. But now I need to understand." This time she lifted her head fully. Her face was calm, but not detached, just worn. "I knew you would," she said quietly. She unfolded her legs and slowly rose, walking to the other side of the room. Her movements were deliberate, controlled. She paused near the supply shelf, not touching anything, then turned to face him. "I nursed him for the first 3 cycles of his life," she said. "He was born weak, but he drank. My body made enough, not much, but enough." Her voice remained level, but something behind her eyes shifted. "Then the frost came early. Our food dried out before the ground did. The riverbed cracked, and we waited. I waited. I drank what I could, brackish water from the low wells, melted frost. But it wasn't clean. I was vomiting before the sun rose, shaking before noon." Julian listened without interruption. Carrie stirred faintly against his chest, but didn't wake. "I felt the change," Omria said. "I felt when the flow slowed. The ache came first. Then the weight left me. My body gave up before I did." She inhaled carefully. 2 days later, I tried again. I held him the way I used to. I sang to him. He rooted. He searched. But there was nothing left. Julian closed his eyes. Omria stepped closer, slow, her hands open at her sides. "Do you know what they call a mother who cannot feed her child where I come from?" she asked. He opened his eyes. She gave a small, sharp smile. "Empty." Julian felt the word land in his chest. They don't say it to your face, she added. They don't need to. They just stop looking at you. You become a woman-shaped space. Something that should have given, but didn't. There was no bitterness in her tone, just a terrible, matter-of-fact sorrow. I left the village before they could make me leave. I wrapped Kari. I walked. I didn't think I would reach the lights in the sky. But I thought, if I could just place him in someone else's arms before he stopped breathing, maybe that would be enough. She paused. Then I found you. Julian didn't know when his hand had started shaking. He shifted Carrie slightly and gently laid the sleeping child in the cot beside him, adjusting the thermal wrap. Then he stood, slowly. He crossed the room until only a breath of space remained between them. Omria didn't move. He didn't reach for her, not yet. He just spoke. I've read textbooks. I know how starvation shuts the body down. I know what happens to the endocrine system. But what you just told me, that wasn't biology. That was loss. That was exile. Her throat moved, but she didn't speak. I'm sorry, he said. A long silence passed. Then, barely audible, she asked, do you see me that way? As what? Empty. Julian didn't hesitate. I see a mother who walked across a dying world for her child. I see someone who didn't stop, even when her own body did. Something broke in her posture. Not a collapse, but a loosening, like something long held finally let go. She looked down, then stepped forward once, closing the distance between them. She didn't fall into his arms. She leaned, gently. Her forehead rested against his chest. Her hands curled into his sides, not gripping, not trembling. Just present. Julian wrapped his arms around her shoulders, slowly, with reverence, not ownership. He said nothing. He didn't need to. They stood like that for a long time, in the middle of a room that smelled of sweat, metal, and heat packs. A place that wasn't home, but had become something close. When Omria finally pulled back, she met his gaze directly. I wasn't sure if I'd ever feel warm again, she said. You're not alone anymore, he replied. She gave the smallest nod, and for the first time something close to peace passed across her face. Carrie stirred in the cot beside them, a soft coo escaping his lips. Omria stepped past Julian and knelt beside her son, resting her palm against his chest. His breathing was steady. She looked up at Julian again. I don't need you to save us, she said. He nodded. I didn't stay to save you. I stayed because I couldn't leave. She held his gaze, then reached for his hand. No words this time, only shared weight, shared warmth, shared survival. And in that moment, in a place where nothing grew anymore, something small and human did. The storm arrived at dusk, not the howling kind that clawed at the walls, but a slow-building force, silent and dense. The air inside the outpost thickened without warning, the temperature sensors ticking upward, pressure readings flickering like a failing heartbeat. The dust outside turned ruddy orange beneath the planet's twin moons, curling like smoke across the ground. Julian noticed the change first. He tapped the console with a furrowed brow, watching a red band widen on the weather scan. Thermal bloom, he muttered. Fast and low, not natural. Omria didn't move from where she sat beside the cot. She'd sensed it too. He could see it in the way her shoulders had stiffened, the tension coiled in her spine. Is it coming here? She asked. He nodded. Yeah, it's already here. Omria rose, silent and fluid, and crossed to the small viewport. Dust had already begun coating the glass, the pale swirls catching the moonlight like oil on water. She stood motionless for several breaths, then turned toward him. We need to seal the vents. I already have, Julian said. We'll be fine in here for now. The structure's rated for high-pressure dust fronts, but it might shake. Carrie stirred in the cot, whimpering, and Omria rushed back to his side. She hummed low under her breath, her hands smoothing his blanket, her voice a quiet thread in the rising stillness. Julian watched her as he double-checked the filtration systems. The room was holding steady, for now. Still, something about this storm felt different, as if it wasn't just a weather pattern, but a turning point. They made it through the first hour without incident. Then the comms console lit up. A blinking message, low priority, unencrypted, routed from orbit. Evacuation protocol initiated. Julian stared at the alert. It was a single sentence, followed by a timestamp and the signature of Central Command. Biological compromise detected. Site evacuation in 72 hours. He sat down, staring at the text, unmoving. This wasn't just a storm. It was a countdown. He didn't speak, didn't move, just closed the alert window and sat in the dim glow of the console light while the storm rumbled outside like a beast shifting in its sleep. Omria approached him without a word. She stood at his side for a long time before speaking. "You've gone still," she said. He looked up at her. "HQ knows I've broken protocol. They're pulling me out." She didn't react. Not immediately. "Will they come themselves?" Number drone retrieval. Automated sweep. Extraction in 72 hours, maybe less. She folded her arms. "And the child?" "They'll leave you, both of you." She turned her face toward the wall for a moment, as if to steady something inside her. Then she said, "They never wanted us to survive." Julian rose. "Number. They just didn't want us to get in the way of dying quietly." Omria's expression didn't change, but he saw something shift in her eyes, a depth that had nothing to do with fear, not even grief. Resolve. Carrie coughed, a wet rattling sound that sliced the tension like a knife. Both of them moved at once. Omria reached the cot first, lifting him with practiced urgency, tilting his body forward. Julian grabbed the scanner and ran it over the child's ribs. Oxygen saturation dropping, pulmonary stress. The air pressure was affecting him, likely stirred up dormant spores in the dust. Xylene biology couldn't filter the fine particulates like humans could. Carrie was drowning in his own breath. "I need a sterile wrap," Julian said. "We're going to compress his chest, clear the congestion manually." Omria didn't hesitate. She handed him a thermal blanket, tearing it with her teeth into strips. Julian pressed one beneath Carrie's ribs, another across his back, and gently but firmly began a compression rhythm. Not too strong, not too fast. Enough to dislodge what was building inside the child's lungs. Carrie cried out, weak, broken, but sound. It echoed through the outpost like something sacred. Then he coughed, a thick, liquid release, and his breath came easier. Julian sat back on his heels, sweat running down his spine. Omria collapsed beside the cot, pulling Carrie into her arms. She held him so tightly Julian worried she might never let go, and then she began to cry. Not silent tears, not reserved ones, but ragged, gasping sobs, the kind that came from places beyond language, beyond control, the kind that cracked stone. Julian stood frozen for a heartbeat. Then he moved to her side, slowly, cautiously. He knelt beside her and placed a hand on her shoulder. She didn't pull away. He didn't speak. Instead, he let his hand slide down her back, offering warmth, not comfort, presence, not promises. Omria turned into him, not fully, but enough that her forehead brushed his chest. Her breathing still shook. Her body leaned, not from weakness, but from weight, from finally setting something down. Julian closed his eyes. He let one arm wrap around her shoulders, the other around the child she held between them. It wasn't intimacy, it was surrender, and it held more meaning than anything spoken. Outside, the wind howled against the outpost, angry and directionless. Inside, three hearts beat in fragile tandem, and somewhere behind the noise, the clock continued counting down. The wind had stopped howling, but the silence it left behind wasn't stillness. It was anticipation, a breath caught in the throat of a dying world. Julian sat by the console long after the storm had passed, staring at the flashing red alert like it might change if he looked long enough. It hadn't. Extraction protocol was live. A drone would arrive in less than 72 hours. No crew, no welcome. Just a sterile retrieval claw programmed to take one human home, assuming that human was alive. He didn't move. Carrie slept, bundled against Omria's chest, his breath soft but steady now. She sat on the floor across from Julian, her back to the metal wall, eyes closed, body too still to be sleeping. She hadn't asked about the alert. She hadn't needed to. The sound it made, sharp, cold, definitive, was the kind of thing even a child might understand without language. Julian leaned forward, elbows on his knees, hands threaded tightly together. He could leave. He could climb into that drone's pod, transmit a sanitized report, and let history sort the rest. No one would ask about the woman. No one would ask about the child. They weren't on the manifest. They didn't count. And yet, Carrie had laughed, just once, just faintly, a rasping, fragile little sound that made the hair on Julian's arm stand up. He couldn't walk away from that. He stood slowly, limbs stiff from hours of stillness. Omria opened her eyes but didn't speak. She watched as he crossed the room to the supply cache and unsealed the last of the emergency packs. There wasn't much: thermal gear, food rations, one cracked canteen, but enough. She watched him work in silence. Only when he pulled down the battered solar blanket from its rack did she speak. "You've decided." He paused, then nodded once. Omria didn't ask why. Didn't argue. She shifted Carrie in her arms and rose with a quiet exhale. "He won't survive an open wind," she said. "We'll need shelter every 4 hours." "I know a place," Julian said. "Canyon system east of here, natural caves. I scouted it once during the second week. Clean rock, good acoustics, no old tech. They won't scan that deep." Omria nodded. "We'll need bindings." Julian opened a toolkit and dropped a bundle of gauze onto the floor. "For the feet. Dust this fine cuts like glass." They worked without small talk. Omria began layering cloth over her legs and ankles, Julian wrapping his boots tighter. He rechecked the insulation on Carrie's wrap, inserting one of the last thermal strips against the child's chest. Omria double-knotted the fastening. At one point, their hands met, both reaching for the last water filter. Neither pulled away. Just a moment. Just skin on skin, warm from body heat. Then back to motion. When they finished, Julian stepped toward the comm panel. "I'm jamming the signal," he said. "Once I hit send, there's no reversing it. The drone will mark the site sterile and continue to orbit. If we're still here when it arrives, it won't see us. But if it does, it won't stop." Omria's expression didn't change. "Then let it pass." Julian hesitated, then inserted the override chip. The console blinked once. Transmission disrupted. Signal masking active. It was done. He turned to her. She had already slung the pack over one shoulder, Carrie cradled against her chest. Her profile was lit by the failing dusk outside, sharp and steady, like a statue carved from storm-ridden stone. "You ready?" he asked. She didn't answer. She just stepped forward and opened the door. The wind outside had died, but the land was thick with orange haze, the air heavy with heat that clung to the skin like oil. The horizon shimmered, colorless and warped. Julian pulled on his mask and stepped into it, Omria behind him, their footprints swallowed almost as quickly as they were made. They walked for nearly an hour before the first break. Carrie stirred once and whimpered, and Omria stopped immediately, ducking into the shadow of a boulder that jutted from the earth like a broken tooth. Julian dropped the bag, knelt, and checked the boy's vitals, slightly elevated temperature, but stable. Omria loosened the wrap, letting cool air touch his skin for a moment. Her fingers moved gently, smoothing the edge of the blanket. She looked down at Carrie, then up at Julian. "I used to carry him like this through the dust fields," she said. "But not for this long, not with no one behind me." Julian crouched beside her. "You're not alone anymore." She looked at him for a long moment, then said softly, "You shouldn't have stayed." "I know," he replied, "but I did." She didn't argue. They walked again after Carrie slept. Julian took the pack this time and set the pace. Omria hummed under her breath as they moved. Nothing melodic, just tone, a pulse, a rhythm, something ancient enough to speak to muscle memory, something older than language. By the time the canyon rim appeared on the horizon, both of them were coated in fine orange grit. Julian's legs ached, and his back screamed with every step. Omria had stopped speaking entirely, focusing on breath, balance, and keeping Carrie's face tucked away from the dust. When they finally reached the first curve in the canyon wall, Julian led them through a narrow cleft just wide enough for two bodies to pass sideways. On the other side, the wind fell away. The air changed, cooler, dry, still, shelter. He dropped the bag and turned back toward her, arms outstretched. "Let me take him." Omria hesitated. Then she stepped forward and placed Carrie into Julian's arms. Julian held the child close. He could feel the warmth radiating through the thin fabric. Carrie stirred, one tiny hand curling against Julian's chest. "He's okay," Julian whispered. Omria slumped against the canyon wall, not collapsed, but surrendered. For the first time in days, she let her knees bend, her spine curve, her breath come heavy and loud. Julian crouched beside her, Carrie between them. Their knees touched. Neither pulled away. The canyon was quiet. Night approached, slow and soft. They didn't speak again that evening. They didn't have to. The wind had nothing left to say. And somewhere far above, a drone orbited in silence, unaware it had already been dismissed by two rebels and one child whose heartbeat still dared to continue. The desert between the outpost and the canyon had no name. It didn't need one. It stretched out like a wound beneath Xylem's pale twin moons, flat, unbroken, shimmering with the heat left behind by a storm that had scoured the land clean. The dust no longer moved with the wind. It floated low, heavy and dull, like ash suspended in mourning. Julian kept his eyes on the ground. He'd learned not to scan the horizon. There was nothing out there but false hope and distance that played tricks on the brain. His boots sank half a centimeter into the silt with every step. The weight of the pack dug into his spine, straps chafing raw beneath his shirt. Beside him, Omria moved in silence. Kari pressed against her chest in the sling they had reinforced with thermal padding and filtered mesh. She didn't stumble. Her movements were methodical, fluid, measured as a dancer conserving breath in the final stanza of a funeral march. Neither of them spoke. Words were too heavy out here. The sun was low behind them, casting shadows that stretched and thinned across cracked earth. They moved with the shadows, not faster than them, not slower, just enough to keep going. Julian's legs burned, his calves cramped by the second hour. When he shifted his stance, his right ankle twinged from a misstep on a stone buried in dust. He bit the inside of his cheek and kept walking. Their first stop came when Kari let out a thin, stuttered cough. Nothing violent, but sharp enough to freeze Omria mid-step. She dropped to her knees, pulled him free from the sling, and opened his wrap just enough to check his chest. Julian crouched beside her, panting, reaching for the portable scanner. He pressed it gently to the child's ribs, still stable, slight fluid buildup, breathing light but regular. "He's okay," Julian said. His voice came out hoarse, almost brittle. Omria nodded. Her fingers trembled as she readjusted the wrap, but she said nothing. Julian set down the pack and fished out one of the 2 water pouches. He handed it to her without comment. She took it, drank, then held it to Kari's lips. The infant didn't cry. He sucked at the edge of the filter in short, instinctive pulls, then stilled again. Julian slumped to the ground beside a jagged slab of dried mineral, pulling his mask down for a moment to let the sweat evaporate from his skin. The air stung his lungs, too thin, too dry, but cleaner than the world he'd left behind. After a few minutes, Omria glanced sideways at him. "Your breathing is too shallow." He smiled faintly. "Remind me to bring lighter gear next time I walk across a planet." "No one walks across this planet anymore," she said. "Maybe someone should have." She didn't answer, but after a moment she reached into the outer lining of Kari's wrap and pulled free a small cloth square, still damp from the water. She handed it to him. Julian took it without a word and wiped the dust from his face. He didn't thank her. He didn't need to. They rested 13 minutes, no more. Then they were moving again. As night fell, the temperature plummeted. The heat that had clung to them all day fled in minutes, sucked out of the air like breath in a vacuum. Julian unrolled the solar blanket and tore it into 2 uneven strips. One for Omria and Kari, the other for himself. They kept walking. He offered her the larger half. She didn't refuse it. Hours passed, time stretched. Steps blurred. Julian's vision began to narrow, sweat freezing beneath his collar, joints stiffening with the shift in air pressure. He adjusted Kari's sling on Omria's back when it started to slide. She didn't protest, but her eyes flicked toward him once, acknowledgement, not resistance. The moment his legs gave out, there was no warning. One step, then none. His knee buckled, shoulders striking the ground hard enough to jar his teeth. The pack fell beside him with a heavy thud. Omria turned instantly. She didn't speak, just dropped beside him and pressed her palm to his neck, feeling for his pulse. "I'm fine," he rasped. She didn't answer. He tried to sit, failed. The cold had taken his strength faster than he realized. She reached over and pulled the pack away, then slid her shoulder under his arm. Julian blinked, startled. "You don't have to." "I know," she said, her voice low, "but I will." He let her brace him. Together they moved, slowly. Not like a soldier and a refugee, not like a rescuer and a rescued. Just 2 bodies, human and not, moving as one through a world that wanted them gone. When they finally reached the rim of the canyon, Julian could hardly stand. His feet were numb, his thoughts frayed, but the cave was close now, less than 100 meters ahead. Shadow swallowed the rock face. It was there. He remembered the angle, the fold, the ledge. Omria found it first. She shifted Kari forward, unfastened the sling, and guided Julian down into the shelter with one hand still resting on his shoulder. He collapsed against the wall with a muffled groan. She lit a heat pack. The low hum of warmth filled the small space, bouncing gently off the stone. Carrie stirred, his eyelids fluttering. Julian let his head rest back, eyes closed, breath hitching. "Next time," he muttered, "we take a vehicle." Omria's voice came soft. "Next time we won't be running." The three of them sat in silence, their breath fogging faintly in the cave light. No one moved. No one had to. They had crossed the wild, and they were still together. Alive. The cave was quiet. They had spent the night in stillness, curled on opposite walls, heat packs wedged between thermal wraps, the baby nestled between their bodies. The only sounds were Carrie's soft breaths, the occasional creak of shifting rock, and the subtle hum of life resettling itself into the hollows of exhausted skin. Julian woke first. His body ached in too many places to count, but there was something softer about the pain this morning. It felt earned, grounded. He stretched slowly, mindful of the low ceiling, and sat up. Omria was already awake. She sat cross-legged near the cave opening, letting the filtered dawn spill across her shoulders. Her cloak had fallen slightly, revealing a web of old scars that ran along the side of her neck, pale against the dark hue of her skin. She didn't flinch under the light, didn't cover them. Carrie was lying on his back near her feet, swaddled in soft cloth and blinking up at the ceiling. His arms wobbled as he waved at the light in slow, curious arcs. Julian smiled. He hadn't seen that kind of movement before, uncoordinated but purposeful. He moved to sit beside the child and lowered himself carefully onto the stone. Carrie turned toward the sound and blinked up at him. His pupils expanded briefly, adjusting, and then a tiny sputtering noise, almost a cough, then again. A hiccup? Number? It was rounder than that, lighter, a sound Julian hadn't heard in, God, years. He leaned closer. Was that a laugh? Omria didn't move, but her head tilted slightly toward them. Carrie kicked one foot, blinked again, and this time made a noise unmistakable in its tone. Laughter, short, choked, incomplete, but real. Julian exhaled sharply and looked at Omria. Her hands had stilled in her lap. Her eyes were fixed on her son. She didn't speak. Julian reached out gently and tapped his index finger against Kari's belly. Another laugh, a small one. It spilled out like a secret and vanished just as fast. Omria closed her eyes, then opened them again and said very softly, "He doesn't remember the hunger anymore." Julian swallowed. "He remembers light." Carrie giggled again, one arm flailing as he tried to mimic Julian's gesture. It was clumsy, more reach than play, but his delight was unmistakable. It rippled through the space like heat from a flame, warming everything it touched. Omria leaned forward, resting her hands on either side of her son. Her fingers didn't touch him. They just framed him, holding space like she had done 100 times since birth. But now, she looked not like a guardian of death, but a witness to rebirth. "I used to wonder," she said, "if his silence meant he had given up, that I had failed to pass on the will to live." Julian shook his head slowly. No child should carry that decision. Omria looked at him, then down at Kari. She reached out finally and traced a fingertip along the edge of his tiny ear. Kari blinked and grabbed her thumb, holding it like a lifeline. Omria's face didn't crumple. She didn't break, but her jaw trembled. Julian said nothing. He only watched as her posture shifted, less guarded, more rooted, as if her body had finally stopped anticipating loss. He sat down beside them, close enough to share warmth. Their shoulders brushed once, then again. She didn't move away. "I brought a data chip," he said after a pause. "It has lullabies. From Earth. They're simple, mostly nonsense, but they work." Omria turned toward him, brows lifted in faint curiosity. He tapped the inside of his coat and pulled it free, a slim, worn device about the size of a stone. He held it out. Omria didn't take it. Instead, she reached across him, her hand steady, and adjusted the blanket around his shoulder. Her fingers brushed his collarbone before withdrawing. "You've already brought him something," she said. "Yourself." Julian looked down at Carrie, who was now trying to curl his fingers into a loop, failing, then laughing again at the failure. The sound had changed something. Nothing. Everything. It wasn't survival anymore. It wasn't desperation. It was joy. Actual joy. In a world that had offered them nothing but erosion and endings, here was a child who had learned, instinctively, to laugh. Julian felt it in his chest like the first lungful of clean air after too long underwater. They stayed like that for a long time. No conversation. No rituals. Just the small miracle of a baby discovering light, movement, and sound. And two adults learning that hope didn't arrive in declarations, but in softness, in warmth, in the quiet decision to remain. Eventually, Carrie's laughter faded into soft coos, then to breath. He slept curled in the crook of Omria's elbow. Julian rested back on his hands, stretching his legs. "You know," he said, "I think he's stronger than both of us." Omria didn't disagree. She only smiled, real and unguarded, and said, "Good." The land changed before the air did. It happened gradually, stone giving way to chalk, dust thinned by wind, heat pierced by a current of clean scent. Julian noticed it first in the taste of the air, less metallic, less dry, like something once sterile had begun to grow wild again. Omria noticed it in Kari. The boy had grown more restless each day, no longer clinging to warmth or silence, but reaching, twisting, kicking his legs with intent. Not protest, curiosity. He was remembering the body he lived in. They had been walking for 2 days since leaving the canyon, following the path Julian had mapped weeks ago, when he still believed he would die alone. Now that same path was marked not in coordinates, but in memory. He could recall where the shadow shifted first, where the rock pooled condensation during nightfall, where an old human sensor node had failed years ago and never been replaced. That failure had left this pocket of land untouched. And in that untouched place, someone had planted a dome. It rose from the horizon like a mirage at first, smooth, low, almost invisible against the terrain. It wasn't sleek, not shining or high-tech, just clean. Transparent panels reinforced with aging steel, solar veins braided across the roof like branches of a dormant tree. No signal beacon, no flag, just a shape that shouldn't have existed in the middle of a world that had stopped hoping. Julian stopped at the crest of the final ridge and exhaled. The slope beneath them dipped into a shallow valley, ringed by dry brush and scattered stone. And there it was, the dome. Omria said nothing beside him. Carrie was bundled against her chest, his small hand gripping the fabric of her cloak. He didn't make a sound. His head tilted upward, as if sensing something unfamiliar on the wind. It smelled faintly of water. Julian took the first step down. The soil changed beneath their boots. Less dust, more packed earth. There were signs of life here, not footprints or machines, but subtle things. Insect hum, warmth rising from the ground. The way sound no longer bounced off emptiness, but was absorbed by growth. The dome's entrance was unlocked. No biometric scan, no retinal check. Just a hatch door, slightly ajar, waiting. Julian reached for it and paused, one hand on the seal. Omria's voice came behind him, quiet. "Why was it left open?" "Because someone wanted it found." He pushed the door. Warm air breathed out to meet them, humid and sweet, with the sharp edge of chlorophyll. Light filtered through layered glass above, casting ripples of gold across the floor. Inside it was green, not the dry, glowing moss of xylem's decay, but true green. Ferns, vines, sprouts pushing upward through reclaimed soil. No ornament, no rose, just living things growing where they wanted. The walls weren't sterile, they were alive, coated in fine lichen and climbing stalks. In one corner, a slow drip of water fed a circular basin where roots tangled in the dark. Carrie stirred in Omria's arms, blinking fast, and then he reached out. Julian watched his tiny fingers stretch toward the closest leaf, brushing its edge. The child stared at it, fascinated, then broke into a small sound, half breath, half laugh. No sickness clung to him now. His skin had warmed. His eyes stayed open longer each day. His body, once brittle, had become something present. Omria stepped inside without waiting. Julian followed. They found a space near the wall where the moss had formed a natural cushion. Julian slid the pack from his shoulders and dropped it with a relieved exhale. His muscles ached, but not with the desperation of survival, just fatigue, human fatigue, the kind that passed. Omria knelt, laying Carrie gently on the moss. The child rolled once, clumsy but determined. Then again, his fingers dug into the green. He laughed, louder than before, real, alive. Omria covered her mouth with one hand, as if unsure whether to cry or laugh with him. Julian sat beside her, knees drawn to his chest, silent. There were no alarms here, no directives, no eyes watching from orbit, no mission, just this moment. Julian turned to her slowly. "You could live here." Omria didn't respond right away. Her gaze moved over the dome's interior, the vines, the soft hum of artificial daylight, the way Carrie had already begun exploring without fear. Then she said, "We already are." Julian looked down at his palms, dusty and scarred. He flexed his fingers. They still worked. They still held. "Do you think this was meant for us?" Omria reached for his hand, not as a gesture, as choice. She didn't answer. Instead, her hand tightened gently around his fingers, and then quietly, deliberately, she leaned in. The kiss was soft, no urgency, just warmth, mouth against mouth, breath shared, the first contact not of survival but of something earned. When they parted, Julian whispered, "I love you." Omria smiled, her forehead resting against his. "I know." Carrie crawled closer and tugged at Julian's pant leg, his grip unsteady but sure. Julian laughed under his breath and picked him up. The child squirmed briefly, then settled against his chest, eyes wide. Omria leaned against Julian's side, her head resting near his shoulder. He didn't shift. He let her rest. Let them all rest. Outside, Xylem's surface remained dry, lifeless and dust-choked. But in this dome, a human, an alien, and a child sat wrapped in something new. Not victory, not conquest, not rescue. Belonging. They didn't speak of Earth. They didn't speak of what had been lost. The world would forget this place. But they wouldn't. Because here, where the green returned, and silence didn't mean emptiness anymore, they had chosen each other. And that made everything that followed possible.